and gentlemen, welcome to Async. It's really nice to have so many of you here tonight. I can see quite a few new faces. I'm super excited tonight. This is Daniel's first proper full-length Async talk, and it's going to be wonderful. It's on a subject that I think all of us know very well and have some opinions on, so this is going to be great. Please give him a huge, warm Async welcome.
Hello, my name is Daniel Berzon. I work at Acaster, which is a digital services studio based here in Brighton. I haven't really prepared a speech of what we are, but we're kind of half agency, half product. There's a couple of colleagues here tonight who also work with us. I'm going to be talking about some research I've been doing in readable code for about the next 4.5 hours, roughly. It'll just seem like that. The only thing to say is that I am hoping this will become a conference talk one day, so apart from the usual questions and disagreements, if you have any comments on the talk itself, I'd really appreciate the feedback as well. So maybe in the pub afterwards you can tell me. The only other thing to say is that Acaster is sponsoring tonight, and we gave you loads of lovely pizza and beer. In exchange, we would like an employee, please. We're hiring, if you know of or are a lead Android developer, some kind of Kotlin genius to replace our beloved Joe, then please could you point them towards join.acaster.com. That'd be great. So, my name is Daniel, and I am really interested in grammar. And I've got a question for you. Here are 2 sentences. Rachel and me went to the cinema, Rachel and I went to the cinema. And my question is, which of these 2 sentences do you think is more grammatically correct? Is it A, B, or C? They're both fine. Just to show our hands, who thinks it's A? Wow, okay. Who thinks it's B? Wow. Almost unanimous. Who thinks it's C? I'm surrounded by grammar Nazis. So my name is Daniel van Berzon, and I am very interested in usability. And I have a question for you. Here are 2 interfaces for selecting an option from a number of options. I want to know which of these do you think is more usable, is easier to use? Is it A, the drop-down box? Is it B, the radio buttons? Or is it C, they're both about the same? Who thinks it's A? Interesting. Who thinks it's B? And who thinks it's C? They're both about the same. This is great. I wish I was counting, actually. So my name is Daniel, and I'm really interested in readable code. And I've got a question for you. Here are 2 snippets of code that do exactly the same thing. They assign a string to a variable based on a Boolean operator, based on a conditional. The only difference between them is what the kind of conditional is. My question is, which of these do we think is more readable? Is it A, the ternary operator, B, the if-else statement, or C, they're both about the same? Quick show of hands. Who thinks it's A, ternary operator? Cool. Who thinks it's B? Who thinks they're both fine? Some people haven't even answered. So my name is Daniel, and like any adult human, I'm interested in all sorts of stuff. Here's a selection of stuff I'm interested in. But I'm going to be talking about usability, grammar, and readable code, because I believe that they are very closely related to each other. And I'm also going to talk about how I think readable code can learn from usability and grammar. I'm going to be telling you about my experiment I did on howreadable.com and how I had some success with it, and I also had a lot of failure with it. What I learnt and what I intend to do with it in the future. So let's talk about readable code. So when you're a student and you're learning to program for the first time, you spend a lot of your time writing code. And you are doing it on your own. And the code that you're writing for a computer so it can do some kind of task, like saying hello world. Fast forward a few years, and as a professional, you spend most of your time reading code. So according to Robert C. Martin, who's one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, he thinks the ratio is about 10 to 1. You spend about 10 times more time reading code than writing code. You're collaborating with other developers, which is what a lot of new developers find difficult. And the code that you're writing for other developers. A computer can understand pretty much any old rubbish, but the people that have to read your code are the people that you're working with. So these 2 situations demand very different types of code. When you're a student, and you're writing code, the kind of code that interests you is cool, clever, efficient, succinct, exciting. When you're a professional and you're trying to read someone else's code, the kind of code that you like is clear, simple, intuitive, structured, even boring. Professionals need code that is easy to read. But the problem is, I believe, code that is easy to read is hard to write. I think there's all sorts of reasons for this. One reason is that there are just too many options. There's too many ways of writing the same thing. Consider a single letter variable name. There are 26 possible options, and the computer doesn't care which one you use. Imagine how many options there are when you're writing a function. Another problem is that spoilers. So you're writing the code, you know what it's supposed to do. It's really difficult under those circumstances to put yourself into the head of someone who's never seen the code before and doesn't know what it's supposed to do. And even if you come up with a perfect option out of all those options that you would be able to understand had you not written the code, you have to consider other people. We all have different ways of learning, we all have different levels of experience, and what you find readable, I might not find readable. Let me give you an example, and I'm terrified of this because this is my code out in the world. Right, here's an array of columns. Each column has an ID and a name. And these columns represent, Freya will recognise this, these columns represent a React component that is the header of a table. And the requirement comes along that only admins are supposed to see the recipient and recipient location columns. So we need my columns array to introduce a boolean isAdmin that will remove the recipient location columns unless it's true. So I give it a go. I've defined an array, actually I can use this, wow, that's exciting. I've defined an array here of IDs that represent the admin column IDs, and then I use filter to filter out the admin column, the columns that are admin columns, unless isAdmin is true. And this works, and it's fine. I'm not very happy with it readability-wise. I don't like the duplication of the IDs here. I don't like how complicated this is. So I give it another go. This time I put a boolean inside the definition of the column that says whether it is an admin column or not. And now that means that my visible columns filter is a little bit more readable. And this is fine, but I still don't like it because isAdmin is in scope when I define the column. So it seems a real shame to put the column in and then to take them out again. So I have another go. This time I define an empty array, and I put the columns in one by one, and I only put the admin columns in if isAdmin is true. And this is terser, but I don't like it because columns.push is repeated 5 times, the thing is now out of whack, it's not easy to see at a glance which ones the columns are. So on Freya's suggestion I give it another go. This time I define some constants which define the columns, and now all I do is I return an array, and which array I return depends on the value of isAdmin. But I'm still not happy with it because the constants are defined in a certain order, but there's no reason I can't change the order when I return the array. Blah, 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 blah. None of this effort is billable because the damn thing worked on the first go. It's very, very hard to persuade project managers to spend money letting you do stuff like this and go round and round and round. So what is readable code? Sorry, I'm going to take a bit of water. No one shouted at my code. Readable code obviously needs to be easy to understand. It needs to be clear in intent. That means that it's really obvious what it's trying to do. It needs to be logical, so that it does things in the way you would expect it to do. It needs to be easy to maintain and change. This is really important because requirements are changing all the time. You need to be confident you can go into your code base, understand what it's trying to do, and then change it in the way you want it. I really like this one. It needs to be unsurprising. There's this thing called the principle of least astonishment. No one should be astonished when they see your code for the first time. Now there's all sorts of ways that you can make your code easier to read. You can do things like you can put white space between functions, or you can indent to show level of nesting, or you can break up long lines. And these are all really important, and I think these are about making your code legible. They're about being able to physically see the code. That's not the same as readable code. For me, readable code is about whether you can understand the code or not. What's the next slide? Yes, okay, cool. So, with readability, there are all sorts of things that you can control. You can control the syntax that you use. You can control the way that you name things. It's really important, naming functions or variables. You can control the way that you approach things. You can control the way that you organize your code, where you put your functions, where you put your files. You can try and be consistent, so if you do things twice, you do them the same way both times. All of these things are to do with the structure of the code. So I think that code readability describes how the structure of code can help a developer understand and control it. Remember this sentence, it's important. What about usability? At its most basic, usability, you've got a user on one side and you've got a system on the other. And you're trying to define an interface between the two that is as intuitive as possible, so that the user thinks as little as they need to be able to manipulate the system. Now with usability, there's all sorts of things that you can control. You can control the visual form of things, you can control the layout, you can control feedback, what messages the user gets, how fast things occur. Things are more usable if they're familiar. If someone recognizes them, they'll find it much easier to use. Consistency is also important in usability, and simplicity. And again, all of these things are about structure. So you could say that usability describes how the structure of an interface can help a user understand and control it. Now you may recognize this sentence. If I show you the git diff, I've only changed a few letters really. Code readability has become usability, code has become interface, developer has become user. And I think this metaphor is actually really useful. If you think of your code base as the interface to your business logic, and you think of the developers as the users of that interface, then code readability becomes about making your business logic usable. But what about grammar? Grammar feels like a very different beast. Most people, grammar is something like this, some kind of grumpy English teacher at a blackboard who's telling you off for making mistakes, such as using less when you meant fewer, or splitting an infinitive, or heaven forbid, putting a preposition at the end of a sentence. But grammar is a bit more interesting than that. Linguistically speaking, grammar is about the study of word forms, which we call morphology. I'm not a linguist, sorry, which they call morphology. Sentence structure, which is called syntax, and how those two go together to create meaning, which is called semantics. And this is really important. Grammar can convey meaning. We use the grammar of a sentence to help us understand it. Let me give you an example. Here is a sentence made up of invented words that are absolute gibberish that I was a bit drunk one night and came up with. Imagine they are in English, but you just don't understand them. What information can we get from this sentence? For example, which of these words represents some kind of action, some kind of thing being done? Brilliant. When did it happen? Did it happen in the past? Is it happening in the present? Will it happen in the future?
Past.
Excellent. You can see where this is going. Who or what is doing the booging? Who or what? Fantastic. And in what manner? Amazing. A large amount of information from this sentence from its grammar. Okay? So we know that you put ed onto a verb to make it past tense, sometimes if it's a regular verb. We know that English, the word order is subject, verb, object. It's an SVO language. Not all languages are like that. And we know that you tend to put ly onto an adjective to make it into an adverb. Grammar has helped us to understand the sentence. So you could say grammar describes how the structure of a language can help a speaker understand and control it. Change grammar for code readability, change code readability for usability, change usability for grammar. Hopefully I've now drummed into you that these three things are very well related. They're all about how manipulating the structure of something can help you to understand it. But what can readable code learn from usability and grammar? This is where it gets interesting. Let's start with grammar. So I ask you this question. Rachel and me went to cinema, or Rachel and I went to cinema, which is grammatically correct? Now, if you ask our grumpy English teacher, they will tell you it's definitely Rachel and I went to cinema. Who said that? Round of applause. Well done. You are grumpy English teacher. There are two pronouns in English for referring to yourself. I, which you use as the subject of the sentence, as in I went to the cinema, and me, which is the object of the sentence, as in Rachel noticed me. The subject is the thing doing the doing, the object is the thing being done to. Since Rachel and I are both subjects of the sentence, you have to use Rachel and I. That's the way you do it, QED. Now the real answer is a bit more interesting. So English has a lot of very complicated grammar rules in it. Here's one. You may have never seen it before. This list of words represents the order, believe it or not, in which adjectives go in front of a noun. So it's the reason why green little men sounds really weird, but little green men sounds fine. Because little is a size adjective, green is a colour adjective, they go in that order. Consider this one. Lovely little old long green French silver serving spoon. Sounds just about right, like that. If you try to change any of them round, I've got an example written down, old long French green lovely, it just doesn't work. Now the interesting thing is no one was ever taught this grammar rule in school. And yet small children will happily say little green men instead of green little men without anyone ever telling them to do it. They will also constantly say Rachel and me went to cinema even though people constantly tell them not to do it. Like teachers, I'm going to drink it. So the adults. Adults also make the opposite mistake. They say things like between you and I instead of between you and me. Even quite intelligent adults like William Shakespeare, who says it in The Merchant of Venice. So what's going on? Why are there some rules that we find really hard to follow, really easy to follow, that are actually quite complicated, And why are there other rules that we find really hard to follow that basically aren't that complicated? So in the 1960s, a linguist called Noam Chomsky came up with this thing called universal grammar. And the theory of universal grammar said humans are born with an innate understanding of grammar. We're born with it. When we learn to speak, we learn the specifics of the language that we're born into, but we're born understanding what grammar is. Now this was a massive change, because up until then, grammar had been what's called prescriptive grammar. That is, the purpose of grammar is to tell people the rules about how they're supposed to speak. And that changed overnight, almost, to being descriptive grammar. The purpose of grammar is to describe how people speak naturally. So to explain the difference, we have to deal with prescriptive and descriptive grammar rules in our daily speech all the time. A prescriptive grammar rule is an arbitrary grammar rule that prescribes the way that people should speak. So these are made up by someone ages ago, and then they become the rule. So for example, you're not allowed to split an infinitive, or you're not allowed to put a preposition at the end of a sentence. Instead of saying, obviously, from who is that from, you've got to contort yourself into from whom is that. Or Rachel and I went to cinema. You have to do it that way, not the other way. These are all hard to do because they are prescriptive, because someone made them up. A descriptive grammar rule is an innate grammar rule that describes the way that people speak. So these can be things like putting ed on a verb to make it in the past, or Bob eats pizza instead of some other order of that, or even our little green men. And because these are innate grammar rules, we find them really easy. So if we look at it from a descriptive point of view, there's Rachel and me, Rachel and I. Rachel and me, Rachel and I are both noun phrases. They are a phrase that represents a noun in a sentence. And when we look at how people speak naturally, we can then learn rules. Like, for example, the grammar of a sentence acts on a noun phrase as a whole, not on its internal parts. So we know this because we say Rachel and me are tall. Rachel and me are both singular. But somehow Rachel and me becomes a plural, and it says are instead of is. You would never say me are tall, in the same way that you would never say me went to cinema. But it's completely fine to say Rachel and me are tall, and it's completely fine to say Rachel and me went to cinema. Both are absolutely fine according to descriptive grammar rules, QED. This is fascinating, but what the hell has it got to do with readable code? Is the big question. So, for something as important as code readability, there's actually surprisingly little literature out there on it. There's Clean Code by Robert C. Martin, the guy I quoted before. There's The Art of Readable Code by Dustin Bowell, which is very good. There's a bunch of videos online that I watched. These are my favourite ones. And there's a whole load of articles and idiom and style guides. But the one thing that they have in common is that they're all really prescriptive. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of talk of idiom. This is code idiom. This is how you code. There's a lot of opinions which are presented as if they are rules. There's a lot of phrases like prefer, avoid, recommended, which have removed the person from them. So it's not I prefer or developers avoid. And there's no references or links to research, ever. They're just rules laid out. So I think that code readability could benefit from being less prescriptive and being more descriptive. Less telling coders how to write, and more about learning from how coders write instinctively. Now there's a flaw, and I'm going to admit it, which is that universal grammar applies to native language speakers, and as yet there are no native speakers of JavaScript, Python, and Ruby. And I did check, and on the Indonesian island of Java, the language is called Bahasa Jawa, so there are no native speakers. But I think there are some useful takeaways. I'm not going to anyone love the takeaways. Accepted rules can turn out to be arbitrary. Just because it's a rule doesn't mean there's a basis behind it. If people keep making a mistake, it might not be a mistake. If it's hard to get your developers to code in a certain way, it might be because it's not a great way to code. All advice should be based on empirical evidence. Now, I don't have any empirical evidence for this advice, but nonetheless, all advice should be based on empirical evidence. And we shouldn't be telling devs how to code. We should be trying to learn from how they code. So consider this situation. According to Robert C. Martin, over half of all developers are junior. He's defining that as less than 5 years, because the number of developers doubles every 5 years, so therefore. So normally you have a senior developer and a bunch of junior developers, and the senior developer prescribes some code style rules and then spends a lot of effort getting the junior developers to follow them. Wouldn't it be easier if we could agree on a bunch of descriptive code rules and then get everyone to follow them, including the senior developer? Before you throw tomatoes at me, let's move on to usability. So, I ask you this. Drop-down box versus radio buttons. Which of them is more usable? So the answer, like too many things in life, is it depends. Radio buttons have advantages, drop-downs have advantages. Radio buttons are better because you can see all the options at the same time, because you only have to click once to select an option, because you can have rich text in the options themselves. Drop-down boxes are better because they take up less space, because the current selection is always clear, and because they work better on a mobile. So for example, drop-down boxes are great if there's a default option that's the recommended one, or if there's loads of options that have a natural order, or if you want the options to form some sort of sentence. Whereas radio buttons are really good if there's a small number of options, or if the user should be able to compare the options and see them all at the same time, or if you want to add context information like the ingredients of your pizza. The problem is that usability always depends on context, and context is different in every single case, which means that it's very difficult to formulate rules, which can lead to a lot of frustration, and which leads UX experts to use a lot of four-letter words, such as test, which is a four-letter word, you might notice. The best way to work out if an interface is usable is to try it out on users. Now, the easiest method, and the way they used to do this on websites all the time, was with a survey. You'd put a survey on the website, and then you'd ask people, did you like the navigation? Did we use too many images, etc.? Surveys are fine, but they have a problem, and it's best explained by the JAM experiment. So the JAM experiment is as follows. Am I going too fast? Is it all right? Okay, good. Psychologists in 2000 set up a supermarket display, which on alternating days had either 6 varieties of jam on it, or 24 varieties of jam. And they ran this experiment for a while. Shoppers unanimously preferred having more options. However, they bought more jam when there were less options. Fewer. Thank you. Grammar Nazis, I told you. Right. Opinion is not the same as behaviour. The shopper's opinion was that more choice is better, but their behaviour suggested that less choice is better. The problem with surveys is they measure opinion, but it's much better to directly test the user's behaviour. So how can you test behaviour? You do things like A/B testing. You have 2 versions of your website, you show them to different people, which one works better. You can do things like user observation, where you sit down with a user, and then you'll get them to perform some kind of task, and you'll take notes on how they're performing it. Or you can do things like automated screen recording, which we've done a bit of at the Castle, where you can give your user the option to record themselves performing a task and then send you that recording. And these are all ways of directly measuring the user's experience. So what can readable code learn from usability? Well, that's interesting. I think the best way to work out if code is readable is to try it out on developers. And I don't mean by asking the developer's opinion whether they think it's readable or not. I mean by directly measuring the behaviour of the developer trying to read it. But how can you, what's the metric? How could you measure code readability? You need an objective metric that you can actually measure. I can think of 2. I can think of one is, can they predict what the code does? So when they see a piece of code, can they understand what it's supposed to do? And how long does it take them to get there? How long does it take them reading a piece of code to get to the point where they understand what the code does? So finally we come to readable code. This was my ternary operator versus if-else statement. So the best way to say if a ternary operator or an if-else statement are better is to look for a descriptive readability rule by testing the code on developers, directly measuring their ability to predict the output and the time it takes them to get to that comprehension, which is exactly what I did on howreadable.com, my little online experiment. And I was thinking this might be a good point to take a break if you guys want to take a break, or were you happy to carry on?
Yeah, I think you've dropped so many knowledge bombs.
Yeah, sorry about that. Would you guys like to, is there any questions beforehand about the first bit of what I've said? About grammar or just baffled a lot? Yes?
How did you get your English grammar?
How did I get my English? It's really bad.
Your understanding? No, it's almost perfect.
Except if you shouted fewer at me. I don't know, I was really bad at it. So when I was at school, I'd write lovely, beautiful essays and then get loads of red marks on them because my spelling was terrible and stuff like that. And so I've always been slightly fascinated by it, like a lover that won't pay any attention to you, sort of thing. But yeah, I read a lot of Steven Pinker. He's really interesting. The Language Instinct, fascinating book. That's where I got almost all of this from. So yeah. Any others? Should we take a break?
Okay.
You and me or you and I? Which one is correct?
Depends.
Because you said...
Well, they're both fine if they're a noun phrase in a sentence according to descriptive grammar rules. Okay, one thing I didn't make clear is that that's the instinctive way of doing it, but we live in a world where there are prescriptive grammar rules. So, for example, you get people who will reject a CV because it has a split infinitive in it. And if you write to them and say, actually, I've got these 3 linguists that say there's nothing like splitting an infinitive, they're not going to listen to you. So you have to obey the rules that you've sort of been taught, but those rules are kind of made up. So it's you and, so the way you're supposed to do it is it's you and I if you're the subject of the verb, and you and me if you're the object.
Just a comment. I did teaching English to speakers of other languages, and part of what we learned was there was some random grammar fanatist tens of years ago who decided to base English grammar rules on Latin.
I had the guy's name, but I can't remember it.
Right, and because Latin doesn't have to be, to think, to go, whatever, it's all one word.
Yeah.
This guy decided arbitrarily that you can't split an infinitive because you can't split a Latin verb.
Yeah. It's
It was made up.
It's exactly the same with the you and me went to cinema thing. Latin has very strict cases, so subject or object case, and he wanted it to be more like Latin, so he said we shouldn't do Rachel and me went to the cinema.
Same guy?
Not sure.
Right.
But my guy was a 16th century monk, so I don't know what it is.
Mine was about 100 years ago.
Oh, well, there you go. Not the same guy.
Yeah.
Let's get some beer. Should we get some beer?
Yeah, so I'm going to set 5 minutes. When this alarm goes off, then the talk starts. I'm going to be real strict about it.
Thank you all for coming back, and thank you for everyone who pointed out my apostrophe that I should have. I was so sure it was going to be code, but it turned out it was spelling. So, howreadable.com is a proof of concept experiment that I, because I'm arrogant like that, decided to put online to see if I could come up with some way of measuring code readability. This was just a try. I wasn't sure if it was work or not. So developers were shown a series of code samples, and then for each code sample I timed how long it took them to read the code. And then once they'd read it, after each sample I asked them, what does the code do? So their ability to predict what the code does, what's the result of it. I asked them how readable they found it, and I gave them the opportunity to leave any comments they wished. So I'm going to show you, I've got it running on my local machine, hopefully. Yes, here we go. This is howreadable.com, there's the mouse. There it is, you choose a language, and then you fill in some information, I won't bother. And then you read some instructions, I definitely wouldn't bother. And then you're shown some code, and I've started a timer now. And you read some code, and then you're asked, what will the value of variable result have? When you're ready to answer, you click that, and I stop the timer. And then you give your answer. You can say how readable you found it, you can leave any really disgusting comments you want. If you want to go back, you can see the code again, I start the timer again. If you go forward, I stop it, and when you're ready, you do the next one. And I repeated that for like 9 experiments, roughly. Slides are back. Excellent. So, the method was really simple. You come up with a code structure that you want to test its readability, such as a ternary operator. And then you write a sample of code that includes that code structure in it. And then you write another one that is identical, but instead of that code structure, you use an alternative. So, for example, an if-else statement. Then your first participant comes along, and at random, you show them one of the code samples, and you collect their results. How long it took them, whether they understood it, how readable they found it. Next participant comes along, you randomly, again, show them a different one. I've just used the other one for illustration purposes. And you collect their results. And then you keep going. And if you get enough results, at the end of it, you take an average, and it should give you an indication of which of the 2 code samples is more readable. So in terms of code samples, I tried to keep them as simple as I could, because I wanted to get a correct response in a reasonable amount of time. They had to have a predictable result, so I couldn't have rand called in the middle of it, because that'd be pointless. They needed to be self-contained, so you didn't need to rely on any code outside of the code you could see to be able to predict the result. Any calculation or logic needed to be able to be done in your head, so no like powers of 3.8 or something. And I tried to avoid any tricks or hidden bugs. So it was just what you see is what you get. So here's an example. Ternary operator versus if-else statement. For ternary operator, and I know I've repeated the result like about 7 different times, but I had a variable called result, which is the result of calling getResult. And getResult, you pass in the value and you return either 10 or 20, depending on whether the value is greater than 4. And I compared that to exactly the same thing. The only difference is I use an if-else statement instead of a ternary operator. So that's to give an example. The participant is asked to predict the value of result. So a few other notes on howreadable.com. I made the experiments available in JavaScript, in Ruby and Python. I wrote the JavaScript in the Ruby. My wife was kind enough to translate into Python, which I don't know if you ever tried to translate code before, but start with. The JavaScript was all ES5. The reason I did that was I didn't want knowledge of ES6 to get in the way of people's readability. If I do it again, I'll offer ES6 and maybe TypeScript as separate languages so that we can separate the results out. The experiments were presented in a random order, so the reason I did that was if people gave up after 4, at least I get a different 4 each time. It was important to get equal numbers of participants in each sample. Now, I don't know, was anyone here at the talk I gave last month? I explained block randomization. I'm not going to do it again, but it's a way of making sure that half the people saw ternary operator and half the people saw if-else statement. You don't get that if you flip a coin. And I captured some other data, how long you've been programming for, what your main language is, and the browser agent and display size, just in case these things affected people's ability to read the code. So participation, I got 247 participants, which is awesome, and I'd like to thank everyone here who participated. If you did, that's great. If you don't clap yet, okay? In terms of language choice, most people did JavaScript, probably because we advertised it so much here, followed by Ruby, followed by Python. In terms of the main language, again, mostly JavaScript, Ruby or Python, some C#, and some people doing Elixir, so congratulations to them. And years programming surprised me. It's skewing really senior, so nearly half of the participants have been doing it for more than 10 years. And in terms of being junior, if it's less than 5, it was less than a quarter of the participants, so that might explain some of the comments. I did 9 experiments in total. I did 4 syntax experiments. So I did ternary operator versus if-else statement, nested ternary operator, the dreaded thing, array.reduce against a for loop, and switch case statements, which are really popular now because of Readable, 2 years ago. I did some conditionals. So I did order of if-else. If you do the negative case first or the positive case first, does it change readability? I did if-else against early return. Does everyone know what early return is? Okay, good.
Do you mind just explaining it?
Very quickly, you have a function and you say if this, return a value, if this, return a value. It's a way of avoiding having to do else. You just return each value as it comes. Sometimes it's called a guard statement. Naming, really important. I did a naming experiment, I did a comments experiment, and I did an experiment on abstraction, whether splitting things into functions made a difference. So, here's ternary operator versus if-else, just to show you the code again. What were the results? We ready? Are we excited? Yeah. Okay. In terms of being able to read it, I got 94.4% for ternary operator and 98.4% for if-else. Time taken, 27.1 seconds on average, 23.1 seconds on average. Very close. Slightly more readable that way. Preference, slightly more for ternary operator. I think it's because of all my senior people. 3.7 stars against 3.4. Now, these are very close. And the only way to tell if this is just random noise or if it's an actual result is to do some statistical analysis, which I am not an expert on, but you were very kind to help me with that. Send it to your data team. So, first thing I did was I drew a histogram. What this is the number of seconds, and this is the percentage of people that took that number of seconds. You can see there's a nice distribution there. There's some outliers, as we call them there. Just delete them, they're fine. And there's a weird bit here I'll talk about in a minute. In order to work out if it was statistically valid, I did a thing called the student's t-test, which I had never heard of before. It gives you a p-value, which I'd never heard of before. But apparently the p-value represents the probability that the results you're seeing are just random noise. So in most social sciences, and thank you Freya for explaining this to me, you're looking for a p-value that is less than 0.05. My p-value was, you ready, drum roll? What's happening? It wasn't there at all. 0.44, which is appalling. So, just to clarify, 0.4 means that there's a 4 in 10 chance that what I'm seeing is just random noise. So, this doesn't mean... Yeah, go on, what's the question?
Did you know how many responses you would need in order to get that down to 0.05.
I don't know if it's the sample size. I'm going to explain a bit later. I don't think it's a sample size. I think it's a methodology issue. But I'm assuming thousands, because there was about 125 for each one, if it's the only 123, math. I had a bit more luck with array reduce versus a for loop. So array reduce, who doesn't know, who's never used array.reduce? Okay. I don't have any slides explaining it in detail. You pass a function to reduce, that's called a reducer function, and it calls that function on every value of the array. The function gets the value, and it gets a thing called the accumulator, and you can do things to the accumulator with that value. So it's a way of reducing an array down into one value. And what this one is doing is I've got some values here, and I call values.reduce. I pass it a function that adds the value to a sum that gets passed each time. So the result's going to be adding them together. We expect the bar result to be 10. Okay? I compared that to a for loop. Exactly the same thing, except this time I define the result first, and then I go through values, and for each value I add it to the result. Do you want some results? Sorry, what's the question?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is the one that you received a lot of comments about, presumably.
Because I didn't put in the initial value.
Yeah.
I was hoping to gloss over that. Yeah, I'll tell you about that in a second. So, reduce 98.4% against 92.4%. Reduce was actually, more people got it right. It's interesting. However, 43.8 seconds against 29.1 seconds. So it was 50% slower doing the reduce than doing the FL statement. That's the for loop, sorry. Preference, however, was very similar. 3.5 stars. This time, my p-value was, drum roll, 0.002. That's pretty cool. Okay, so this is a statistically significant result. Can I round of applause, please? I'm scared it might be to do with the fact that I didn't put the initial value. However, reduce was 50% slower than a for loop, and I can prove it. So I've done 2 experiments. So far I've had a statistically valid result and a not statistically valid result. Now, that's bad news. That was my only statistically valid result. Sorry for wasting your time, you may now go. I think I know why, and I'm also quite impressed I got 1, and thank you for the applause for that. This is the first time I'm ever doing it, I'm not really an expert. Before I explain why I think I got bad results, I do want to talk about a couple of the other experiments. I think they're interesting in themselves. However, word of warning, I don't have a statistically valid result to tell you. Naming. Whenever you read any book about code readability, the first thing they talk about is naming. Dramatic pause. There are only 2 hard things in computer science, cache invalidation and naming. That was Phil Carlton. I definitely think this is true. I spend most of my time writing code trying to work out what to call things. Imagine this. What does this function do? Shows a panel! No, it doesn't. It tells you whether you should show the panel. I've seen this all the time. This show panel, show. What about this? What the hell could that mean? It could mean set completed flag to true. It could mean has the action been completed. It could mean send me a list of completed actions. It could mean run some procedures to complete the action. I've even seen it as run some post-completed actions. If completed, then action.completed. Ambiguous naming is not always obvious. So array.filter I've used all the time. I even did an example of it earlier. Probably we've all used it. It's a way of removing elements from an array. So filter is ambiguous. If you filter something, you have a liquid with some stuff in it, and then you pass it through a filter, and you end up with a liquid called the filtrate and some stuff called the residue. But what's not obvious is which one you want. If you're making coffee, you want the filtrate. If you're panning for gold, you want the residue. Filter does not tell you if it removes elements or if it selects elements, but we use it all the time. It should probably be called array.select. So I decided to test this out. I did an experiment called generic versus specific. This is where the code gets a bit hairy. I've got a result, which is a result of calling is anagram of, and is anagram of devil and live. Is anagram of is the result of calling process string on my 2 inputs and asking whether they are equal. Process string does this horrible thing here, where you get a string, you make it lowercase, you split it into an array, you sort it, you join it, and you trim it. I know this is not readable code, I'm trying to test this, okay? The result of that is to put it in alphabetical order. I compared this to exactly the same code, except I called the function sort alphabetically. I wanted to see whether giving that extra context in the function name made it easier for people to parse what was going on. Instead of the generic process string, the specific sort alphabetically. And the results were interesting, and I can't tell you about them because my P was 0.2. Oh. Slightly too high. Sorry about that. You can see the pattern coming here. Comments. This is really interesting. Before I did this research, I sent out a questionnaire, which some of you might have seen. I got 22 responses. I was asking questions about readability. How much do you agree with this statement from a scale of 1 to 5? My statement was, if you have to write a comment, your code isn't readable enough. Most of the time on the things I asked, I got most people agree, most people disagree. These were the results. 6 people thought 4, 6 people thought 1, 4 people thought... It's across the board. Some people really agree with this, some people really disagree with this. I watched some videos when I was researching. Here are 2 of them. They're both called Writing Readable Code. Dmitry Pashkovich, in his video, says, your ideal should be our code does not need comments. Tom Hudson, in his imaginatively named Writing Readable Code, says, practically tell a story with your comments. These are 2 completely different opinions on comments, told as if they are rules. It's an example of what I was talking about before. So I decided to do an experiment. Here's some code with no comments in it. Var result is do ranges overlap, and then 2 ranges are called scores and desired, just to call them something. And my do ranges overlap function calls this bit of stuff here, which some people won't agree, some people won't believe me, and I got a lot of comments saying this doesn't do that, but this is the way you see if 2 ranges overlap. Does the end of one range, is it greater than the start of the other range, and is the start of your range less than the end of the other range? That gives you all the cases of overlap. Okay? This one had no comments. I decided to compare that with a thing called what comment. And what I mean by a what comment is a comment that exactly describes what the line below is doing and therefore gives you no extra information. So for example, for any 2 ranges, do they overlap? Doesn't tell you any more than the fact that you have a function called do ranges overlap, which you're calling with 2 ranges. And they're all like that. Range of schools, var schools equals blah. I compared that to one with a single comment that I call a why comment, which is giving some justification for the thing that you're seeing. So this comment says, 2 ranges overlap if one starts before the other end and ends before the other starts. It's not a lot of information, but it's giving you at least a justification. It's saying that the line below is the algorithm for if 2 things overlap or not. And finally, I compared it to a bad comment. So most people complain about comments because they can get out of date with your code. You change the code, but you forget to change the comment. So this one says, 2 ranges overlap if one starts before the other starts and ends before the other ends. That's incorrect information. It is not describing what the line below is doing. It is a bad comment. Now in my head, because I'm quite prescriptive to myself, I imagine that the what comment would probably make not much difference, perhaps a little bit more time just to read the things. The why comment would make things more readable, and the bad comment would make things less readable. And unfortunately, I can't tell you what the answer is because my P was 0.34. That's really high. This is really frustrating, right, for me as well. Why am I getting all these high P values? So I think there's a few reasons it could be. It could be that there's no effect. It could be that ternary operator and if-else are just as readable as each other, and therefore there is no effect, and what's called the null hypothesis is true. Might be true. I don't think so, but it might be true. It might be that the effect is small, and that my experiment is not sharp enough to get the effect. It's too blunt. There's some evidence for that, because all of my how did they predict it were above 90%. It's possible that my snippets of code are just too easy, so people were reading them too quickly. The one that you mentioned, it may be that the sample size is too low. So 247 I was really impressed with, but it's only 123 per snippet. If you've got 4 snippets, it's even less than that. If I had thousands of people, maybe I'd get better results. Or it might be there's a problem with the methodology. I think there's a problem with the methodology. Let me show you something again. This is my histogram, and we had our thing that looks a bit like a distribution there, and our outliers there. But there's this weird bit here. There's this kind of long tail to the distribution where people seem to be taking as long as they like over a period of time. What is this bit? Why the long tail? I think I know why, and I think to give you an understanding of why, I'm going to show you some of the comments I got in the comments box. Get ready for this. Okay. I would ask for a complete rewrite on code review. I'm not keen on the use of abbreviations because they look could hurt to root. A ternary operator will be better here. If else should be used over ternary operator where possible. I need to get these guys in a room together. Shadowing a variable name result wasn't a great start. The variable name is misnamed. It's not strictly a name, but rather a salutation. Thank you for that. String.prototype.car will be better in every way and simpler. In addition, this does nothing for I-18N support. But what's the text with the bad code? This is my favourite one. Get ready for this one. If you write this, you are bad and you should feel bad. I think there's a problem here, which is that reading code and reviewing code are not the same, right? Sorry, I'm going to drink some more because I'm quite angry at that comment. I think there's a finite time it takes to read and understand code. If you see some code and your aim is to understand it, once you've understood it, you stop reading it. If you're reviewing code, you can take as long as you like. Ooh, where's the mistakes? Where's the mistakes? Ooh, where's the mistakes? Where's the mistakes? I think the reason I'm getting high p-values is because some participants are taking longer to read the code than necessary to understand it. Hopefully I can fix this one day. Let's talk about the future. The first thing I'm going to do is try and fix the time to comprehension problem. One thing I could do is just show a timer. If people can see that there's clock ticking, they're probably going to realise they're supposed to hustle a little bit. This was a mistake on my part. I'm going to remove the comment box, partly because I don't want to feel bad, but also because I think having it there suggests to people that the purpose of what they're seeing is so they can review the code. I'm going to try and do better instructions, something like, some of this code might be bad, that's okay, don't worry, the world isn't going to end. Yes?
You could have like a league table of like who's guessed right fastest.
Interesting.
As a way of actually show it
to gamify it, yeah.
That could, like, because you need lots of users. I do think you need lots of users as well, and it could get you lots of users if you've got that kind of.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about was if I wasn't doing this out of my own pocket, was incentivizing as well. Like, if you do this, you get a £5 gift voucher or something, or whatever.
I don't think that would work.
No?
Extrinsic motivation is not why people would do something like this.
Okay.
The gamifying is a great idea.
I really was trying not to use that word.
Yeah, but it's worth noting that you'd have to be careful because someone would try and hack it just to get to the top of the leaderboard. That's always what happens.
This is written in Rails, so that wouldn't. Maybe a fixed time. Instead of timing people, I give them 10 seconds to read the code, and I just use the did they get it right as the metric. It's a possibility. I'm very much open to other suggestions because I think there's some data here and I don't know how to get to it. Other stuff I want to do. I did 9 experiments, one of them passed. I'd like to do code golf. Has anyone heard of code golf as a phrase? Yeah. It's a phrase for writing code in as few lines as possible. When you play golf, you try to get the ball in the hole in as few strokes as possible. Does that affect readability? I'm pretty sure it does, but I'd like to prove it. Booleans. Not A and not B is the same as not A or B. Is there Boolean algebra you can do that makes things more readable? I've definitely seen some Booleans in code reviews that I suggested actually this reduces to one thing if you do a bit of maths on it. Chaining methods versus intermediate variables, like everyone sneered when they saw string.car, blah. Would it be better array equals string.split, this equals that? Consistency. Everyone talks about it. People say that your code base should look like it was all written by the same person. Does that really affect readability though, is a question. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is the aim of this is to find descriptive rules for code readability. Experiment isn't the only way of doing it. There might be another approach. So linguists tend to do research by searching what's called the language corpus. And you can do this yourself if you want, and it's great fun, and I spent hours on it. Books.google.com ngrams, you can see graphs of over history of all written literature, what the popularity of words were. So this is fantastic against terrific against fabulous against awesome. Awesome is the up and coming newbie, whereas fantastic's been there forever. And this stuff's great fun, and linguists find stuff out using this. This is one of the things they used to find out about between you and I, whether that was grammatical or not. Could we do this with GitHub? There's a corpus of written code out there. Is there some way we could use GitHub's search API to find out the popularity of ternary operator versus if-else? Does that tell us anything? Don't really know, it's just a slide. Yes, hello.
You can do that. Somebody fed GitHub corpus into Google's BigQuery. You can do queries over GitHub.
Really?
Yes.
Let's do it! Come help me. So, the future, what else am I going to do? I'm going to try and do some more statistical analysis of my existing results. It may be there's data there and I just don't know how to find it. I'm not an expert. I'd never heard of a student's test before I got the results and went, increasing sample size. Like you mentioned, marketing, this is my first attempt. Howreadable.com, the best place ever. I'd like to offer some more languages. Like I mentioned, ES6, I'd like to offer Java. I need to make some harder and more realistic tests. I think actually the magic numbers is also a problem. I think they should look like bits of real code. And I'd like to get some help and some funding. Not that these old pound coins will help me at all. But, I'm doing this on my own time and I'm at my own pocket, and you know, if someone gave me a budget, I could really get some interesting answers. In the meantime, while waiting for me to do that, what can we do? Avoid array.reduce. It's worse than the for loop and I can prove it. Okay? I think we should be taking the advice of readability literature. I know I was down on them saying that they're really prescriptive. However, doing something about readability is better than doing nothing, and a lot of the advice that they give is very sensible. But we should question prescriptive rules. If something feels like someone's just made it up, it might be that someone just made it up. If in doubt, try it out, and preferably try it out on a junior. So if you're not sure if your code is readable, show it to someone. And don't ask them, do you think this is readable? Ask them, what does this code do? And finally, help me. If you're interested at all in everything I've said, info@howreadable.com, come find me in the pub afterwards. I really want to get some results from this because I'm really sorry about those high p-values. And most of all, thank you very much for your time. Are there any other questions apart from please let me help you? Please. Yes.
Can we see some of the other results that didn't have high enough p-values?
The problem is literally because they didn't have high enough p-values, they're meaningless. They're literally meaningless.
But you're looking for a descriptive result
This
based
is
on a
really
prescriptive
dangerous.
p-value.
This is really dangerous.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Prescriptive p-value, yeah, you can
Yeah.
change it to, but the highest one anyone's ever used is 0.1, right? And some people insist on 0.01. 0.2 is, it's a 1 in 5 chance. It's meaningless.
Yeah, but we won't take them seriously.
Also, something completely baffling, like the bad comment was more readable than the... I just think it's wrong. I just think it's because people are reviewing the code. However, I should say, and I didn't mention this, I tried to do people who left a comment against people who didn't leave a comment. On average, was there a difference? And there wasn't. So, yeah. But maybe you review the code and then decide to not leave a comment. I don't know. Yes?
Do you need to capture people's primary spoken language?
Interesting. I didn't do that, but I should. It's a very good point. Especially for the common one. It's a very good point. Flynn?
Could you factor in how long it took people in, like, one person to do each question? Like, you had some really smart cookies who whizzed through them, then maybe that's kind of an important thing to work out how long they took compared to each person for each individual question, depending on they were given able being randomly.
The problem is I don't know what I do with that. I don't know how to correlate it.
You could
I
weight
thought-
it.
Weight it?
Weight each result based on their average time for completion.
So this is a fast person and then normalize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is then it's meaningless unless they've seen both samples. Because you can't say this sample is more readable than the other if they didn't see both. You can do things like show them one and then show them the other, but then having seen one, they know what it's supposed to do. So there's
Do you mean
probably
with this-
stuff I can do with that.
They might have just happened to get all of the easier to answer, or the more readable results, and therefore they seem like a faster person but aren't.
Yeah, but you can't assume in advance which ones are more readable. That's the problem. Otherwise, I could like say,
Oh, no,
make
you
sure
can't
everyone
assume
gets a
it,
hard one, an easy one, a hard one, an easy one. But then you're assuming in advance what the result is. So I don't know. Yes.
The second in your list of ways you could improve the method, I think was about the difficulty level.
Yeah.
And I think that there's two reasons to increase the difficulty level. One is you're trying to presumably advise people about what code's readable, so they can take that away and use it in a professional environment rather than this kind of like bubble sort of thing. So longer code examples would be good for that reason because they're more like reality. So more bits entailed in the problem. And the other reason is that a lot of it's like how people perform once their short-term memories full up. So you've got like such small problems, like you're showing people almost like a circle and a triangle,
Yeah.
I'm not a coder, and I could basically understand what you showed me there. It's like, which is more recognisable, the circle or a triangle? It's like, well, they're both super recognisable. Are you not using that kind of that sort of deeper intellect that you have to sort of bring, start using once your short-term memory is full? The short-term memory is absolutely tiny compared to other parts of the other types of memory. So it's like fill up the person's short-term memory with or overflow the person's short-term memory.
Yeah.
So that you're using the parts of the brain that they normally call on when they're trying to solve a hard problem. And
So I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. I think that one thing that occurs to me as an issue with it is that one of the reasons I think stuff was too easy was because I kept getting the 90%. They're reading it too quickly. But the aim is to get as much of the effect itself as possible into the time. If you've got a massive piece of code and there's only one line of it that you're actually trying to try, you're going to run the risk of drowning out that one line that's only a small difference within it, unless you did like 20 ternary operators.
But you're not testing the lines of code, you're testing the structures of the code, right?
Yeah, but I'm trying to see if a ternary operator is better than if else statement. So how would I do
we
that?
use several ternary operators in one, I don't know, yeah. I'm not.
Yeah, no, that could work. That could work. Or show people 7 times the ternary operator one and average their results or something, but people are not going to do that.
Or even just get people to remember like 7 bits of information and then show them the ternary operator or something. Like
Yeah,
that.
maybe
Like Danny says, just overload the short-term memory.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
This might work better as like with user testing where you sit down with someone. This might work better as a sort of actual experiment where you're with someone.
Yeah.
They've probably done this. I just couldn't find the front. Yes.
This may not be relevant to the result, but I find it interesting that you offered 3 different languages, and that your intent was to test grammar. But presumably you wrote the experiments in one language, JavaScript, and translated to...
I actually wrote them in Ruby.
Ruby, interesting. You translated from Ruby to JavaScript and to Python. And in theory, if you'd started with Python and translated to Ruby and to JavaScript, you should get the same results. I'm not entirely sure. Well, in the case of human languages, it's not that simple.
Yeah, sure.
Something written in French translated to English not going to turn out the same as something written in English translated to French. There may be a factor there.
So I wasn't sure whether the language itself would make things readable or not. I don't know whether Ruby is more readable than JavaScript. I feel it is, but that's just still like Ruby. But the issue... So originally I offered more than one language so I could get as many people as possible doing it.
Yeah.
However, all the results I showed you tonight, and I didn't say this, sorry, they're all just the JavaScript ones. Because it got too weird otherwise. A lot of the average ones just didn't work. There's problems like you don't have a ternary operator in Python. So the translation, the best we could do was an inline if, double if statement. It's not the same thing, so I didn't feel like it was a fair result. The results I showed you tonight were JavaScript, and they were the majority that I got. Some of the Ruby comments were unbelievable. Yeah, Cassie.
Just an observation. I hate people that start sentences with that after a talk. But
Is this a question?
I taught some code bar students that had tried to do the readability test.
Interesting.
And a couple of them got through it. There were 2 people that dropped out because of the comments box. Because they thought their opinion was that they didn't have enough of an opinion to leave a comment on it, so it overwhelmed them a bit and they dropped out.
Definitely getting rid of the comments.
So yeah, I think
I wanted it there mainly so people could point out mistakes I made in the code because I didn't trust my own code, but I'm definitely going to get rid of it. And if you guys help me to write some really good snippets, it's gone. That's great.
Also, another comment on the timer. When you said at the beginning of the talk that you were timing it, I thought, oh, that's really interesting because I didn't see a timer, and if there had been a timer, I would have been massively put off doing the test because I have really bad anxiety and that would have stressed me out and I probably wouldn't have done it. I don't know how many other people would do that, but there might also be potentials that people would panic and guess and would lose the point of reading through it calmly and understanding it and then saying whether they've understood it or not. I wonder whether it would become a little bit too competitive, like too gamified.
The first question you asked is how long have you been in programming.
Yeah.
Show the timer for people.
Yeah,
in
maybe
5
show
years.
the timer for the people that
I
would.
think you should
Can
give
I
people the
compare those
option.
results?
Then yeah, that's true.
Give people the option, and if they want the timer, show it. And if they don't, record their time anyway, but don't show them
Then
the
do
timer.
I,
We're making this harder for you, aren't we?
This is great.
but this is a really important point because with your participation, the more you split it up, the less you've got
Yeah.
valid results. So I need to find something that maybe the timer's wrong, but how do you signpost it? How do you tell people don't review the code? The code is going to be bad. I just want to see if
You can A/B test it with and without a timer.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
that's
could.
true.
I think.
Do I get
I
feedback?
think a timer, the effect of anxiety will be evenly distributed anyway. So I don't think the worst anxiety will obviously be a factor. Like I say, it's not going to change the results because you have equal chance of each test having anxious people in it.
Except if juniors are more anxious than seniors, then it skews the results.
But then that's a variable you have to
Only if I can split
define.
my age, which means I split down my results. You see what I mean?
That was going to be a question about your block randomization. So
Yes.
this is to make sure that everyone, like, there's an equal number of people take part in each test. But
As close as possible.
But it wasn't block randomization based on your seniority, so you don't have an equal number of seniors.
Yeah, I didn't
Taking track in one
stratify
thing
it,
is
so you can with block randomization have a different. Sorry guys, basically you define a string in advance rather than flipping a coin, and so you do your string as. No, I'm not
Yeah,
going
let's
to
do
do
your
that.
other talk.
I'm not going to do that. But basically, it's a way of, because you know in advance who's going to get what, you can make sure that over time you have roughly equal amounts in each. And the random is done by ordering them rather than flipping a coin, sort of thing. You can stratify, so you can make a new string for each thing, each bucket of stuff you're interested in. So if you think age affects it, you can stratify by age or whatever. But again, you're cutting down the number of results. If I had enough money to get 10,000 encoders to do this, then we could totally do this and we could drill into whatever we like. But I don't know if there's a way of doing it. I don't know if there's a way of...
You could still cut it. I mean, like, even if you only had 2 results in a very specific bracket of age and seniority and blah, 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 you can still take all of the results together and say, well, we didn't have enough results for this specific age bracket, but if we take them all, we know.
Yeah, but I'm not interested in justifying it. I'm interested in getting results. I'm not doing this so I can tell my client, I'm sorry we didn't manage to do it. I'm doing this because I want to know, is a ternary operator readable in the first place? Because I genuinely care. I really want to know.
But within the if-else,
Yes.
there's ways of structuring the if-else. I mean, do you open the angle bracket on the line of the if, or do you drop it onto the next line? And one thing I can't stand if I'm taking on some code
Yeah.
is if there's a closing angle bracket and then the else is after it. The first thing I'll do is restructure it and bring the else onto the, I'll spend a few minutes actually doing it in the way I like.
Ooh, I could make the snippets editable, then we get real. I ignored legibility.
Different programmers are going to like
Yeah.
to see it in a different way, aren't they?
I ignored legibility and I decided to standardise in terms of various things like Airbnb and all that kind of stuff as to where to do it. Although I'm not claiming they were that well written, these snippets, but yes, we could investigate that. We could see if there is a way to put, and that would be great because then we could tell Airbnb, no, you're wrong. We put the curly bracket after it. Pete.
You could ask someone to write it and then just test the code that they. You don't need to check that the code's valid, but just if they write if else or if they use the ternary.
Oh right, so it's a coding test.
Well, yeah, you don't phrase it as a coding test because you're not going to check how valid it is. But if you just search for a question mark or the words if or else.
I think we can get that, like you just said, from searching GitHub.
I think that's
And
also
that's
kind of
even better
different.
because that's code that's been reviewed and people have accepted. I guess there's a danger that it could be prescriptive rules they've followed.
Yeah.
There's that, and there's also the fact that people can prefer a reduced statement, it still takes them 50% longer to read it. There's that difference between what people prefer.
Okay, but then what do we measure? What is readability then? Is it liking the code? Is it going home happy, or is it your ability to understand it?
Oh yeah, that's an important distinction.
It's going home happy.
So it should be. I think we should go home happy. Yeah, go on.
So I think Cassie's points were bang on. It feels to me that this is an extremely important area that you're quite right, there's not been nearly enough sort of proper scientific research done in this.
Why not? We're scientists. This is crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I probably speak for everyone to say this was an incredible talk and really well done. And what I want to see is you going off and doing this talk at conferences, drumming up support and getting enough people doing this howreadable.com and watching this experiment evolve, because I think it's really important. It's especially important to note that you had like nearly half of people, over half of people have been doing it for 10 years, because people are going to feel more confident expressing their opinions when they've been doing this for a long time. I mean, hell, I've been doing this over 10 years. I still get imposter syndrome and stuff like that about this. It's very hard for people to sometimes form an opinion about it, and it's crucial that you do manage to get that sort of proper stratification. So I think partly it's just sort of getting the sheer weight of numbers if that pie chart doesn't change, but also it is trying to sort of work with people who are perhaps newer to code to make sure that this is as friendly and as approachable as possible.
I mean, I think I'd like as much help as I can get. I'm sorry to keep saying that, but I think the approach is do another pilot test of roughly the same number, but with different ideas about how to make it better. See if we get better results. If we do, maybe try it again. Once we get the best results, spread it out. I think, but maybe that's the wrong approach. I don't know. I'm going to start up a Slack channel. So I was just
to say on that note, do you want it shared like now? Do you want everyone to tweet it? Do you actually want to wait until you build the next version?
It's down, that's the problem. I stopped it because partly because I wanted to start charging me. And because I want to open it up again when we've got another version.
Yeah.
The first plan is let's Slack about it, let's design a new one, and then let's put up another version and try.
I'll talk to London Code Bar and some of the coaches about how to encourage more juniors to do it. So I think that could, potentially help.
Could you incorporate the test in your tutorial material to see who gets, and then somehow empirically, not empirically, but by a softer feedback, just feedback which ones people get better.
It's interesting, we can use the test.
Definitely.
That'd be cool, actually. We'll do that.
Just got a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is the online MOOCs, MOOCs, I forget what it stands for. But you set assignments, you do your code, and you submit it, and you're only allowed to submit it 3 times. If it doesn't compile or it falls over the runtime error, I'm thinking of edX.org, and then you failed that particular assignment. To give them assignments, so it's very critical. But there are thousands of people, like 5,000 people doing one course, and they'll have lots of data. And the thing I was talking about metrics and what to measure. If someone's written some code and you don't understand it, you don't really quite understand exactly what they've written, there's a chance that either won't compile to number compilers, or it'll hit a runtime error, index out of range. File closed when it should have been open. That sort of thing. So by looking at runtime errors from production environment, you could get access, and just look at the kind of code and look at a few hundred of them and look for patterns and the stuff that doesn't really.
It's interesting because I assumed as a basis, as an axiom, that I was interested in readability of code that worked. But maybe there's stuff to be learned from code that doesn't. I haven't really had a chance to process that, but that's a really interesting point.
It's about off topic.
No.
Yeah, so I had one thought, I guess, which plays on the point you made about universal grammar at the start, the Noam Chomsky thing.
Yeah.
So you're very much, well, to an extent, you're assuming that for this, that underpinning it, there is some sort of, underlying way that people understand code. And it just
I'm hoping it's true. I don't know.
Right, yeah. And it just occurs to me that certainly with more senior developers, it could be that what you're seeing is not anything innate about the human brain. It's just a familiarity with different techniques, and they're just used to processing that.
It's really problematic. We were talking about this in the break, weren't we? So as with grammar, when in real life, there are people out there who are going to reject you if you make grammar mistakes. Loads of people pointed out the apostrophe because they felt that, I don't know why you felt you needed to. What's wrong with you? No one misunderstood it, it was understandable. But I think that, so juniors don't have as much experience, and seniors probably have too much experience. How do you measure the prescriptive rules being drummed into you? or following Airbnb guidelines, or your boss for 5 years hated ternary operators. How do you remove that from instinctive grammar? Maybe there isn't instinctive coding. I'm just hoping there's a bunch of empirical rules that we can agree on.
So in a way, it's kind of language, isn't it? And you could get two completely different language groups, and one understands this really quickly because they use this all the time,
Yeah.
and the other understands this really quickly because they use this all the time. And you're not actually measuring anything innate. You're just sort of saying, what do people do? What do people tend to do?
Then we might as well go to the pub, 'cause it's I think, so it's interesting because we also talked about this. It's like, do you define readable code as the code which the majority of people are going to be able to read, or do you find it, or is there some actual thing? Is a ternary operator special in some way? And I think maybe the best we can do is say, if you use array.reduce, it'll take 50% more time for people to read it. Maybe that's the best we can come up with. I don't know if there's an underlying truth we can find. It'd be great if we could. Go on.
Sorry, back on to Cassie's earlier comment about timing.
Yeah.
I don't know that I did this about a month or 6 weeks ago. I don't know whether I wasn't paying attention or I didn't say that it being timed, but I was kind of doing it whilst I was eating lunch in a cafe. So I think my result, I probably did
It might
something
be
quickly
that.
and
It might be as simple as telling people every time.
you know.
I got one comment from a guy saying I had a really long phone call, so I think the timing. I don't know how they knew I was timing them. Perhaps they read the source code, haven't they? But yeah, it's interesting. Yes.
It might be like completely irrelevant. How is the P number derived?
I have absolutely no idea. Freya doesn't know either. Talk to their data people, or if anyone's done statistical analysis, you know, do you know?
Yeah,
So ask her.
It's, what I remember from my psychology is basically like a t-test and like stuff like that. It tends to be the difference between variables with some factor of the difference in results with like taking into factor the quantity. So like that human over there said earlier about like if you had more people, it would be more significant. Then at that point you end up just getting correlations which don't necessarily mean anything. So if you ask 100,000 people what colour their hair is and what their favourite sandwich is, you can get a result from that. So,
but it's important to point out that the method I use, which is students' t-test, technically only works if it's a normal distribution, which is looks like that. I have no idea if it's a normal distribution. It didn't look normal, it looked really abnormal. So that's one of the reasons I said what I really like is some statistics experts to look at my code, my data, and go, oh, you know what, you missed that. Actually, comments are really good. I'm thirsty. Thank you guys so much.